Hello, my name is Kittu Randhawa and I'm the chair of the Indian Subcontinent Crisis and Support Agency, the first NGO in Australia specifically for the South Asian community. I would like to first acknowledge that I am coming to you from Darragland, and I would now like to pay tribute to all those victims who have been lost, or those people who have lost someone through domestic and family violence. A form of violence which is all the more abhorrent because it largely occurs in a place we call home, where everyone should feel safe, and at the hands of those that are considered to be loved ones who should be protecting and keeping us from harm. I want to talk today about some women who have been lost around me from my community. When I first started to work in domestic and family violence, my community, the Indian subcontinent community, the first reaction was to tell me to shut up. I was made acutely aware of the hostilities towards me and other people like me who raised their voice that this was unacceptable. Not only was the community in denial, but there was also keen collusiveness about keeping the silence on this and not letting it air in public. Around that same time, not far from where I live, a woman who the police did know about because they had attended her home for domestic violence situations, she was found burning on her front lawn. Later that day, she died. Her name was Brahminder Kaur, and that was in 2013. Earlier this year, her husband was acquitted of her murder. Shortly after Brahminder's death, another woman was found with acid or chemical burns, and weeks later, in early 2014, she also died. Her name was Monica Chetty. In her case, there's still a $500,000 reward for any information on her situation. These two deaths, which happened very close together, one in December, one in January, they hold real significance for me because on one hand, this was exactly the kind of situations people like me wanted to prevent in the first place. But on the other hand, their deaths meant that the community could no longer be in denial, and they had to accept that we had an issue in our community. Then in 2015, Prabha Arunakumar was stabbed in Parramatta Park. Many believe this was just domestically motivated, but nobody's been prosecuted so far. In 2017, Harjeet Kaur in Glenwood was killed by her husband in their home. The husband later committed suicide. And then last year, in 2020, Kamaljit Sidhu was killed by her husband, and that trial is yet to take place. What disturbs me about these women is that years later, there's been no justice for them or their families. Consider what sort of message this sends perpetrators and the challenges that we face in supporting our clients. All these women come from what is really a small part of the population in Western Sydney. 3 of them lived within a 15-kilometre radius. When 5 women die in one small community relatively close to each other geographically, it doesn't take a genius to work out that there is a significant problem. Women of our demographic and other CALD communities are reluctant to report, which will continue unless they see some justice for victims who are like themselves. When we come together to try and raise awareness and we want to eliminate violence against women, we need not just commitment, but corresponding action from those who make policy and put systems in place. The lack of appropriate response, legislation, and culturally appropriate support systems means that the system itself forces victims to stay in their abuse-ridden situations. We in the CALD community need to call out complex forms of abuse and violence, and the system then has to respond to those. There's a responsibility on all parties in addressing these issues. We know at times that some of the issues that are very culturally being perpetuated may seem repulsive and repugnant to some, and they may seem too hard. But doing nothing is not an option because that will be at the cost of more lives, either through death or someone living in hell. Culturally based abuses such as dowry abuse, honour-based violence, female infanticide must be considered in the holistic domestic and family violence space. And then there's that most ultimately unpalatable issue where so many shirk from, and that is the role of women that in some communities who perpetuate the abuse, provoke the abuse, and they maintain the code of silence. We cannot disregard the impact that they have, because everyone has a right to feel safe in their homes and with their families.